Hello. It's a privilege to be here in Mexico City. I have never been to Mexico City before, and that is an embarrassment, and so thank you for allowing me to correct that. As you heard, I'm a professor at Harvard Business School, and I head up the leadership area. And what I'd like to talk with you about is the research I've been doing on collective genius. For the past 10 years, I've been looking at exceptional leaders of innovation, individuals who have built teams or business units or organizations that can innovate not just once, but time and again. Unfortunately, we in the academy are very siloed. So even though there is a great deal of research on leadership and a great deal of research on innovation, there's not very much that looks at the connection between the two. And I'm an organizational anthropologist, so what I have done is spent my time looking at leaders up close and personal as they do their work with their colleagues, and based on that have begun to look for commonalities and differences in how they lead. And what we found when we studied leaders who had built these organizations that could innovate time and again is that they did a lot in common. What they did and why they did it, very much, lots of similarity. But how they did it really varied, because how they did it reflected their own individual leadership styles, and to some extent, I'd also say the national culture. Because we have studied leaders in now, I think, 12 countries, and for sure, we know that national differences make a difference in how we lead others. The one thing that we've learned, though, and it was really a shock for me, is that if you want to build an organization that can innovate time and again, we actually have to change our notion of what leadership is about. Leading innovation is not about creating a vision, communicating that vision, and inspiring others to fulfill that vision. And that is what I learned about leadership when I was in school. But that does not work if, in fact, you're trying to build an organization that can routinely innovate. And the way I define innovation is anything that is both new and useful. It can be a product, a service, a business model, a way of organizing, a process. It can be more everyday innovation, or it can be more breakthrough innovation. So we have a very broad definition. And despite what many of us like to think about, when you look at how innovation happens, it's never about a solo genius having an aha moment. That is not how it happens. It's actually about a collective process. So one of the leaders that I've had the privilege of studying, and I hope many of you will get to hear from him tomorrow, is Ed Catmull, the founder of Pixar. So I've been studying Pixar since 2005, when they made the movie Ratatouille, to this day. And one of the things that you see when you go to Pixar is that it really does take a collection of people to get it done. It takes about 250 people, 4 to 5 years to make one of those movies. It can take a very, very gifted animator 6 months to perfect 10 seconds. So it's a very precise, difficult process that they go through. And one of the things that happens as they're making the movie is that the story evolves. It's not set in the beginning. In fact, it might be quite bad in the beginning in some ways, but it evolves over time. And so what you see happening when they're making a movie is what one of the executives told us is a rather messy process, but it's certainly very iterative. They learn as they go. And one of the things that you see as well is that an animator, the animators are working on various parts of the movie, because the shots don't go through in sequence and they go through at different speeds depending how difficult it is to do something. So some of you may know Monsters, Inc., the blue monster who has hair like mine. That took many, many months for them to perfect, and I know exactly how they feel about that when I get up in the morning and have to get my hair done. Or the shadows that are under the cars. Those were very, very difficult, and they won an Academy Award for figuring out how to make those shadows under the cars. So it's not accidental that those movies are so beautiful. So one animator told us about a time that he had come up with an idea about a particular character, and he showed it to the director. And the director saw it and said, "Beautifully done, but that's not the way I see the character, so please lose that work." And the animator said, like all of us, he was disappointed because he had put his heart into that. But fortunately for him, a couple of weeks later, the director came back and said, where are those seconds of film? Let me see that again. And the director took the animator's idea, it sort of changed the point of view of the director, and what they would say at Pixar is because that animator was able to share his slice of genius with the director. The director had a new sense or a more nuanced sense of that character, and the story improved. So for all of you who I know want to lead innovation because you have lots of things you want to get done, what we have to do if we want to really create innovation in our organizations is we have to figure out how do we unleash all those great ideas that individuals have, but then we have to harness them and leverage them to make them useful. Because if it's just new, it's creative maybe, but it's not useful, so it's not an innovation. So what we know about innovation is that it's often a journey. It's a journey, a collaborative kind of journey between people who have diverse talents, diverse points of view, and that's really an important piece of the puzzle. And it's going to be a discovery-driven process. You cannot plan to innovate. You have to act your way to a solution. And the final thing about most innovations is they're often the combination of ideas. They're not usually totally new. Sometimes it's a couple of old ideas reconfigured to solve a new problem, but that's the reality of it. And the most important reality of it is that it's really hard work and it's very scary work. And so even though it's exciting and exhilarating, it's really scary and really hard, particularly as they say at Pixar, you're on a plane, you jump out of the plane, you have no parachute, you hope you have one built by the time you get to the bottom. That's the process that people go through. Now, many of us are in organizations that cannot innovate like this time and again. We don't see it, and we know it's not because we don't have talent. We indeed do have talented people. We do have people with slices of genius in our organization. But somehow we haven't figured out how to get those people to work in a way together, to collaborate, to get this done. And we saw that in these organizations, what the leaders did is they focused on building a context in which people would be willing and able to do this collaborative work. And I hope in the question and answer we can talk a lot more about that. But let me just describe for you a little bit about what the capabilities were. And so what the capabilities were, there were three: creative abrasion, creative agility, and what we called creative resolution. The first one, creative abrasion, is really about the idea that the way you get a lot of ideas out is you actually have to amplify the differences in your organization. You don't minimize them. You want those differences to come out. So the reason why it's creative abrasion is when you have passionate, talented people who have different points of view, you're going to get some conflict. But you rarely get innovation without some diversity and some conflict. So in these organizations, people know how to actively listen and inquire, but they also know how to advocate for their point of view. The second one, creative agility, is about this discovery-driven learning. So for sure, it doesn't surprise me at all that design thinking has become very important to understanding about management. Because what you see when you're trying to innovate, again, is you can't plan for it. Really, innovation happens through trial and error. You're going to have false starts. You're going to have missteps. You're even going to have mistakes as you find your way to that solution to the problem. And being able to do that, that kind of agility to test and experiment, is something that the organizations learned how to do. And then the final one, creative resolution, was how you made decisions. So in these organizations, because you want to combine ideas, you want to kind of do more both and as opposed to either or thinking, what has to happen is you have to have a decision-making process that is very clear. Because if you don't have clarity about decision-making rights, it makes everybody crazy. Having said that, though, they have a very patient and more inclusive process. So people are not willing to compromise just to go along to get along. And they're not willing to let one group dominate. They won't let the bosses dominate. They won't let the experts. They're going to continue to have, if you will, the debate to work it through. So you see that creative resolution. If you can't do that, if you went through the first two, but then you just pick one, as opposed to looking at ways to combine them, you're going to miss out on the innovation. And then, of course, what we saw is these leaders spent time developing the culture necessary to support, or the foundation for those capabilities to exist. And I will tell you that I'm at a place where supposedly we're supposed to innovate and have a lot of free time and all of that. And I don't know that my own organization has, as well as we'd like, those capabilities. It's not easy to build them in the organization. And as you scale and grow, it becomes complicated. And we looked at some of that. We also looked at leaders who had to change the organization. It wasn't innovative, didn't have these capabilities, and moved to that. And one of the reasons why I think it's just great for you that you'll get to hear from Ed is that Ed not only built Pixar, which has been innovative from the beginning, if you will, he also turned around Disney animation. So he knows about both, and we wanted to look at both of those processes. And I want to also reassure you that we didn't simply look at, so we did look at companies like Pixar and Google. We wanted to look at companies that had created whole industries. So we also looked at eBay Germany, which was considered to be the most innovative piece of eBay. We also looked at companies like an Islamic bank in Dubai, a luxury brand in Korea, an alternative energy company in China. So we've looked at a whole range of different contexts to see that they had these kinds of capabilities. But fundamentally what these leaders ended up understanding is that their role was to set the stage more than perform on it. And they understood that people don't really want to follow us to the future. They want to co-create the future with us. And that's not an easy, it requires a different way of thinking about what your role is as a leader if you're going to be in that co-creation process as opposed to the one who's out front sort of getting people to follow them. So I hope that gives you enough food for thought for us to have a conversation. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to your questions.
I want to ask you something, and it's regarding all your experience about your research. Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the central question to being a good boss?
You know, so I made the mistake of trying to write 2 books at the same time, and I have collaborators, but they were both late as a consequence. So the other one is called Being the Boss and talks about the 3 imperatives of being a great leader. But one thing that I will step back and say before going back to how do we all learn to do this, what I did see about these leaders who were good at leading innovation, and I think it's probably true of almost all leaders, whatever they're doing, I think what kind of leadership you need to have varies depending on the circumstances. So I would say that I want to just correct one thing, or make sure that I don't make this mistake. All of the leaders that I studied were visionaries. They did have a point of view. They just understood that it wasn't just about them. So I do think that this idea that you have ideas, you're creative about it, you're willing to stretch yourself is an important piece of it. But one of the things that these leaders all did is they were very demanding. They stretched people. They had very bold ambition, appetite much bigger than their current capabilities. They were learners, and they wanted to build organizations where people were willing to be learners. So I think that that's very, very critical to the process as well. So they were demanding, but the other word that immediately comes to mind is that they were generous. Because of how hard this work was, when people made missteps and mistakes, some of those mistakes were seen as really praiseworthy. Some mistakes are blameworthy. You shouldn't have made them. They're wrong, right? Others, you're trying and you made the effort and they're praiseworthy. And so that generosity led people in the organization to feel a sense of psychological safety. So I think what you want to think about as a leader is you're trying to create an experience for people that will allow them to be their best selves and to utilize that slice of genius. And so the 2 questions I always ask leaders to think about is, how do people experience you? What words would they use to describe how they experience you? And how do they experience themselves when they're with you? And related to that, going back to the 3 imperatives of leadership, the first imperative of leadership is always about managing yourself. You're the instrument. You're using yourself to get things done. So you have to actually get kind of control over yourself, right? Which is probably the hardest part of all, as we all know. The second one is managing your network, and that's about managing all those relationships with people over whom you have no formal authority, but you're deeply dependent on to get your job done. And many of us think of that as only as politics. And many of you will say, I don't do politics, I just do my job. Well, if you don't do politics, you will be powerless. Because all organizations are inherently political. And I don't mean highly politicized where the political animals are winning and we can make a TV show about it. Don't mean that. But they're inherently political because of the diversity that's built into organizations. And there's a lot of research to show that if you don't manage that network, you will be powerless, you are much more likely to behave unethically, you will not be aligned with your organization, you won't have the resources you need to get the job done. So that's a really important imperative. And you will not be able to innovate because being able to bridge across is very important for innovation. And the final one is managing the people who report to you. So I think one thing about being an effective leader today is also having the right mindset about what relationships really do matter and all of that. Thank you. Yes.
Well, it is related to the same. Will you please provide us of some examples of different kind of leaderships that we need in different situations?
So as I said, one of the things that some of the leaders we looked at were already in organizations that were quite innovative. Others were turning them into innovative organizations. And our research was longitudinal, so we could look over time at these situations. And if you looked at how those leaders went about the change process itself, it was very much about create the vision, communicate the vision, and inspire people to fulfill it. The type of leadership that I've learned about, that's what they did. The kind of leadership they wanted at the end was different. So one of the leaders we looked at, for instance, was a leader in India. And the problem in India that he said, and I'm using his language, is that the way people are educated is they're not really educated to use their judgment. When they go to school, basically the teacher dictates and they're supposed to repeat. So part of the problem is you have these people who've been trained that way. If, teacher says whatever, you just repeat it. So the leadership in his organization was, the leaders thought their role was to set direction and make sure no one deviated from it. That's how they saw their job. And so until he changed that, they weren't going to be able to be more innovative, going back to what I've described before. So in that instance, he used a very classic method of leading where he said, this is where we need to go. We need to change the way we all think, both the followers and the leaders, about the role is. We're going to change our culture, then we're going to build strategic partnerships with key customers, and then we're going to, who knows? He said very clearly, I don't know what it'll look like. And this is going to be a 6 to 7 year journey for us to really make the changes we need to make. And so he did it in a very classic, get people to be dissatisfied and understand why they need to change, give them a model of what the future can look like, and the process he used was just classic. But what he wanted them to do in the end was to think about building context, to sort of change their notions. And so he actually said, he said to the company, we have to turn over the growth of this company to what the people he called the young sparks, to the young people, because the demographic in India is very young. This is an outsourcing company, right? So, and he said, whether or not we grow is going to depend on the capability of the front line. So that ended up being, and then that process of understanding, he called it inverting the pyramid. He's a very provocative man. I encourage you to read. He wrote his one book much faster than I wrote our book. I was mad at him about that. He called me and said, they've asked me to, I introduced him to the Harvard Business Review, and they wanted to write an article. Then they thought it was good enough to write a whole book, and his book was out quickly. He ran a whole company, turned it around, got a book out, not the professor. But anyhow, what he called it was employee first, customer second. Very provocative, told his customers about it. Radical transparency, but the whole point being your customers can only be satisfied if your employees are deeply satisfied and connected and engaged, really engaged, and feel a sense of ownership. So by what he did, he ended up with a 25 or 26-year-old who came up with a $15 million cost savings effort for one of their clients by unleashing the ideas in a very structured way. You don't want chaos here, because you can get chaos. Once you amplify and unleash, you as a leader have to be comfortable with that conflict, and you have to know how to harness it. Otherwise, you just have chaos, right? Many of us have experienced that, I'm sure. So I think that leading change is classic that way. The style, they're different. And I also, about this one leader I'm talking about, Vineet, one of the things he did is he said some things he did with brute force. Very top down, very directive. Some things he did very bottom up, participative. So the actual tactics you need to use really varies depending on the circumstance. And we actually talk about 6 tensions that you need to manage as a leader that vary where you should be with regard to these 6 tensions varies depending on what you're trying to get done in a circumstance, in a given circumstance. I have one last question.
How you can figure out the thing between leading and co-create?
Well, leading and co-create, they're one and the same. See, I think this is the mindset when you're talking about innovation. These leaders, the leader plays an important role. I don't want you to think that's what I said about the brute force even. So when you're co-creating, people need your assistance as a leader to do that properly. So one of the things that the leaders did, for instance, is there's a culture, and I didn't go through all what the cultures look like. Each organization had a different culture, but they had some common values and things in them. But the leaders actually, and you need someone to, for instance, hold people accountable for behaving consistently with that culture. So one rule, for instance, was you must make sure that the minority voice is heard. Doesn't mean you do what the minority voice wants, but you need to make sure they speak up, they're listened to, and people hear them. So if a leader felt that that wasn't happening, the leader is going to step in and say, wait a minute, we haven't, this person's been trying to speak. And so there is a role. And the person I ended up, the acknowledgments in the book, I acknowledged two people. The first, well, one of them is a man who was in prison, Ahmed Kathrada, for 27 years with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island. And Robben Island, and Nelson Mandela, I think we'd all say, is a great, great leader who knows very much about leading from the front and doing change. As far as I'm concerned, they also know about innovation, because what they tried to do in South Africa is a social innovation, right? There wasn't a war there. And what Nelson Mandela says is you must always remember that there are people who are nimble. And what you want to do is create the context in which those nimble people can do what they need to do, and others will follow them. But you're in the back doing that. So his model of leadership is leading from behind. But he was very quick when he needed to lead from the front and do things that were very unpopular with his own, quote, followers to co-create what they needed to do. So they're not inconsistent. It's not about abdicating responsibility. It's actually a much harder role actually, to sort of figure out that tension. But I encourage you to read his autobiography, because there's a man who knows a whole lot about leadership and a whole lot about leading innovation. So he was the one. The other person I wrote about was a woman who was responsible for helping Michael Jackson from the time he was young to express his talents. Needless to say, the man had problems, but she was one of the first people I ever studied, and it was right after she was sort of helping him with the moonwalk. So I've always, for many, many years, because I've been a professor now for almost 30 years, hard to believe at this point, but the first person I studied, I was very interested and studied lots of people and did a lot of consulting with people who were leading individuals who were truly geniuses, right? And have you seen This Is It? This will be did you see that documentary? To me, the most powerful moment in that documentary is when Michael Jackson tells the young woman who's a guitarist to move forward, and he steps back, right? So he set the stage for her to be successful. You see her looking at the star and saying, really? You're the star, I don't want to get kicked off this show. And he actually has to push her to go out. And that's what I think you're trying to do as a leader. You're trying to say to people, I'm good, I know I'm good, but guess what? You're talented, you deserve to be on this stage, and we're playing together, and I'm going to push you out there maybe before you even know you're ready. That was the last question, so I want to thank you very much for your time and attention, and I am very happy to be here and trying to figure out when I can get back here. So, appreciate it.